So it's an honor, a privilege, and a pleasure to welcome Miko Peled into this space. I have to say that I am a longtime admirer ever since I learned about your story and your narrative as the son of an Israeli general that nonetheless became an anti-Zionist voice for moral clarity. And you also helped me when I first got on social media create some virality because I took a video of you where you were speaking at some university where you talked about the agreement between Lord Balfour and you said it was just two white guys giving away somebody else's country. You could do that kind of thing back then. And I knew when I heard you say that, I said, okay, this guy gets the relationship between Zionism and white supremacy. This guy gets the relationship between Zionism and imperialism. I have been an avid fan and admirer of your work ever since. So it's an honor to have 30 minutes to discuss with you where we are in our contemporary moment, in the fight for Palestinian liberation. So thank you for joining me.
Well, the honor is mine. I'm also a big admirer. So thank you for having me. I'll just make a small adjustment to your intro. My father never gave up Zionism. He remained a Zionist, and he believed in what we know today is this ridiculous idea of a two-state solution. In fact, he was one of the people who, as an Israeli, as a Zionist, started talking about that immediately after 1967, while still in uniform. And from that moment on, even though he was a general, he was well known, he was a fully Zionist, he became an outcast because he talked about the two-state solution. And I was in Congress just last week, and I was talking to someone. He used to come here as a retired general. So as a general, he was a persona grata, oh my goodness, As soon as he started talking about the Palestinians and the two-state solution, he couldn't get a meeting with a staffer.
No, definitely not.
He would speak in synagogues and he would beg Americans to stop send money and weapons to Israel.
Yeah.
He was an outcast, and he was as fully Zionist as you could be. So it's very interesting because now they talk about the two-state solution. And I'm like, well, what were you in the 70s and the 80s when this retired general was coming here begging you to do something about this?
Yeah.
Now, it's not even worth talking about unless you want to discuss it. But it's very, very interesting that how the atmosphere is so profoundly Zionist, and they go along with the insanity and the lack of clarity and the lack of reason, just in order to continue supporting this, like you said, this white supremacist ideology that's killing Palestinians and really destroyed Western Asia and North Africa. I mean, really, that is the one factor that has brought so much suffering and war and so on.
Without any question. And so I just want to apologize for the dangling participle. When I said that the son of a general that became an anti-Zionist, I didn't mean the general was anti-Zionist. I meant you.
Oh, you meant me. Okay, I misunderstood.
Yeah, okay, no. It was I could hear the dangling participle. After the fact, the modifier wasn't clear. But that gives us a great opportunity, right? Because even to take a liberal Zionist position was enough to get you ostracized, right? Because of the depth of the hardcore, genocidal, iterations that obtained and still obtain, right? That the retreat into liberal Zionism is a defense mechanism that's designed to try to preserve Zionism. So that brings maybe into our first kind of point of conversation, because the way that I've tried to organize these in the past is around the past, present, and future of our liberation struggles, right? So I usually start with the present and then go to the past and then the future. So where are we in this moment? Like, you as someone who has dedicated your life, to struggling for Palestinian liberation, for educating people, for getting people politically engaged. Like, when you look around at this current moment with the escalation of, Zionist warfare in Iran, where are we? Help us, with your perspective and moral gravitas, frankly, take stock of where we are today.
Here we are with the gravitas again. Um,
They didn't hear our pre-interview conversation.
Oh yeah, I'm glad you keep bringing it up. Gravitas is a important part of my personality. Anyway, so where are we? It seems to me, I mean, nobody's got a crystal ball, but it seems to me that this is the fireworks before the end.
Mm-hmm.
The fireworks before everything collapses. I mean, this attack on Iran is, I don't think you have to be a military, expert to see that it's suicidal.
Absolutely futile. Yeah.
America can't win. There's no way America can win, which means Iran is holding strong, as they should. They were attacked for no reason whatsoever. Yep. In this, the apartheid regime, the so-called Israel, for decades now, the state apparatus has been collapsing.
Yep.
Has been rotting from inside. The Zionists were always very proud of 2 or 3 main pillars of the regime, of the Zionist regime. They had a great education system. I mean, my parents were born in the 1920s in Palestine, and they already had a full education system.
Yep.
From kindergarten all the way to university.
And Palestinians still today remain one of the most educated populations on the planet, despite the apartheid, right? Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. But I'm just talking about the apartheid.
Of course.
The apartheid. Yep. The healthcare, they had really great free healthcare. The judicial system had at least a reputation of being clean. Now, the education system is completely collapsed.
Yep.
Higher education is very expensive, and the K through 12 is in shambles. The healthcare system, Hadassah hospitals, which were like the flagship of the healthcare system, is collapsed financially. Conditions in the hospitals are horrific. And the judicial system and healthcare has become very expensive, and the judicial system is so politicized and so corrupt, and the police are corrupt. I mean, and the army, that's the other thing. The other pillar was the military. We had this, they believed they had this great military, and we saw on October 7, is completely malfunctioned. Everything malfunctioned, and it wasn't the first time, because exactly 50 years and 1 day before October 7, 2023, was the 1973 attack, which caught the Israeli military completely surprised. And once again, everything nothing functioned. So there's nothing there. Everything is completely falling apart. So all it really needed was a push. I think that October 7 shocked the system in a way that it will never recover.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it took them weeks before they could even find, the light switch, so to speak. I mean, before they could figure out what the hell had happened, while this very meticulously planned and executed
uprising.
Operation caught them by, shocked them, and every system failed. Everything failed. Everything failed. And then they went on this, this vicious genocide of innocent, which is what bullies do when you humiliate them. They find the weakest, most defenseless victim, and they take their rage on that. And that's exactly what we've been seeing in Gaza. So everything is collapsing. So all it needs is a push. And I have a feeling, and again, we're not getting reports because nobody wants to tell us what's going on, but it's clearly that the attacks from Iran, the missiles from Iran, are very damaging. So it seems to me, like I said in the beginning, these are the fireworks before the end. And I never thought they would be crazy enough to attack Iran. Or I guess their hubris was so, the level of hubris was so insane that they would do something like that. But they did, and I think they're paying a heavy price. And this could be not the beginning of the end, but the end of the end.
The end of the end. So it's what's the word? Affirming for me to hear you make that assessment. Last night, or yesterday afternoon rather, at an event organized by Riverside for Palestine, an organization that's been doing Palestinian liberation work here in Southern California. I described what we're witnessing both from the Zionist entity that shall remain nameless, right? We give it Voldemort status because Israel is actually a name of honor in the Quran. It's a name of honor in the Bible, right? It's a name of honor in the Torah. They don't merit the name. I'm a practicing Muslim converted when I was 15, and I say that name, that real world, that real word, with the weight and significance that it deserves. So the Zionist entity that shall remain nameless, I said, is suffering its extinction burst because the American imperial project in which it is embedded is also undergoing its extinction burst. We've had 5 centuries of white supremacist empire, Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, French, British, and then after World War II, the United States of America took that mantle. And each one of those prior white supremacist empires went through a decline phase where its currency had previously been the reserve currency for the world and starts to get sold off, right? And we've seen that happening with the U.S. And what the mistake that they made, and Richard Wolff, the great Marxist economist, has spoken about this, and I take his vision on this very seriously, is that what usually happens is that they hasten their own collapse by extending their imperial extraction and military activities further and further to try to suck more resources out for that oligarch class while the imperial core itself crumbles. And I think that if you understand that this is both the extinction burst, like that last gasp of a dying empire, and its proxy. And I think that that's also an important thing to understand. And we can talk about this when we talk more about the lessons of history. But for me, it's very, very critical to understand that, yes, there are all kinds of compromise that various Zionists have on Congress people and stuff like that. But the United States empire could end any of this just by withdrawing weapons and support, right? This idea, so I have a special needs son, he's autistic. And when you're getting rid of a negative behavior, oftentimes that behavior resurfaces dramatically right before it's extinguished, right? And I really like that as a metaphor for what we're facing, because we see that these imperial caged animals respond with their most brutal forms of violence and theatrics of power precisely at the moment where their power is waning and most threatened, and in fact dying. And I think that that's what we're witnessing, both with the twilight of American empire and the Zionist entity in which it's embedded.
And we're seeing this with the war in Ukraine. I mean, why did they push NATO to a point where Russia had to respond this way?
Correct.
They knew what they were doing. The promises were made to the Russians that NATO would not expand eastward and so on. And they knew this was going to happen. And now with Iran, I mean, the same thing. They knew they had to know what the response was going to be, that this was going to be catastrophic for the Gulf states. It was going to be catastrophic for, world's economy and so on. And they did it anyway. Both of them. And I think those two represents exactly what you just said. Why would you do something so insanely suicidal and unnecessary unless the process that you just described is taking place? So
it's unfolding there. It's dying before our eyes. And I mean, when I'll just be very brief on this particular point, but I read the autobiography of Malcolm X when I was 15. I converted to Islam before the week was out, and that was the beginning of the entry into my faith tradition and also to the Black liberation tradition. But one of the things that I learned from the Quran, and I found that this is in all of our sacred texts and all of our faiths and philosophies, is that all empires fall. Right? Empire is doomed. It's an inevitability. It is coming. So wise people prepare for it, and for what we build on the ashes of empire. But we're witnessing the imperial collapse. I wanted to go back to one thing that you said in your framing before we move directly to the past, which was that you talked about the operation on October 7th and how it caught the Zionist entity and exposed the fraudulence of its supposed vaunted military might, right? And I think that it's really, sort of, I want to just drill down on that moment, because I also think that this is really crucial. This is one of the places where I, also developed a huge amount of respect for what you do, because on October 9th of 2023, I called October 7th Operation the modern day equivalent of Nat Turner's slave rebellion, right? Because I understood how to read it within the context of white supremacy. And then I said, and that these mass rape allegations that they are circulating, that this is the preceding proximate cause that they want to try to offer for mass lynchings, right? So that you have a rebellion of the oppressed, then false accusations of rape, any of this sounding familiar, and then mass collective punishment in the form of lynching. Is that once I understood how to read Zionism as white supremacy, because actually it was Malcolm that framed it in those terms, and I can talk about that in a minute, then you start to understand that the playbook never changes, right? And I just want to say one thing about that, is that your moral integrity, became clear to me in the way that you spoke about that operation and that uprising, refusing to condemn, and because I was asked on Middle East Eye, actually, on Al Jazeera, I was asked, how do you think Malcolm would have responded to events since October 7th? And I said, well, I don't know. I don't like to put words in his mouth, but I know how he would have answered the question, do you condemn Hamas? Right. And then I continued. I said, because the right of occupied people to resist their occupation up to and including armed resistance is something that's enshrined in international law. It's not debatable. I argue further that it is our responsibility to resist occupation. It's your responsibility to resist, this never-ending stream of harm upon your people. I can't, if somebody tries to enter my home and harm my special needs son, I can't say I have a right to resist, but I'm going to forego that right and let them harm people that are in my care. It's a responsibility. It's not just a right.
And it's a double standard too. One side has the right to inflict all the violence they want, but the other side, God forbid, they have to be, perfect little victims and say sorry and bow their heads. But yeah, I said this, I kind of been saying this a while. If Yahya Sinwar was not a Palestinian, we'd all be wearing T-shirts with his face on it.
Yeah.
He's like, it would be like Che, it'd be like Malcolm, it'd be like, but because he's Palestinian and they always invoke the Hamas issue, then of course you can't do that because you're supporting terrorism and so on. But the hypocrisy and the double standard, and also, I mean, as soon as these rumors, these horrible accusations against the Palestinians came out, I said, this is complete nonsense. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? Where did you pull that out of?
Every accusation's a confession, right? I mean,
absolutely. And we know that now for sure, if anybody had any doubt. But it's insane. I mean, it's exactly like you described it. We cannot allow for the oppressed who stand up, and particularly when they succeed, to get away with it. So we have to do something about it. And the other part, the part that's disappointing to me particularly, is that it was a successful operation. It was so successful that actually even Israeli generals were commending them on how successful they were.
Right.
But their ability, because they're breaking away from a concentration camp, because they're breaking away from, something that could maybe be described as a maximum security prison.
Yep.
Whereas their resources are limited.
Yep.
So they're able to do what they did. And then where's the world coming to finish the job? Support them. Look what they did. Look what they did. And I don't know if you remember this, but a couple of years ago, there was a prison escape. 6 Palestinians escaped from this maximum security prison using a spoon. And suddenly the spoon became a symbol. So it was a brilliant operation. I don't know how they managed to do it. And then they were out there for several weeks before they were caught. And they were caught one at a time. And I assumed after the first few days that they crossed the border. They're gone.
Right.
Only to realize nobody took care of them. They were hiding in a bush or in a cave, and boom, 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 they were caught. I'm going, why didn't anybody support them? Why didn't anybody help them cross the borders, go overseas, do something? And it's the same story again and again and again. The Palestinians are showing incredible courage.
And where are we?
Huh?
And where are we?
Where are we? How come we weren't there to support them, to finish the job, to help them out? Instead, we're sending them weapons to wipe out hundreds of thousands of people in a concentration camp. Why are we never there? Why is the world never there? And I know why, but it's just incredibly disappointing every single time these things happen, and things become always worse for the Palestinians, always worse, always worse, always worse. And it's a ridiculous question. What's it going to take before the world wakes up finally and says, okay, done? I don't know the answer to that, but because if this didn't do it, I don't know what will.
We know that one way or the other, Palestinians will keep fighting for liberation, and the moral failure is upon us for not coming to their aid sufficiently. And I hope when we get to the future part of the conversation, the way that we organize for effective contestation of Zionist power and American imperial power, like that's the reason why I've taken on the political engagements that I have. So I have a very particular theory of how that needs to happen, and I do hope we can circle back to that before we get to the end. But I do also want to be respectful of your time, so I want to move us into the past, because I know that you're somebody that's written about your own family history. You know, you've examined carefully the history, you know, of not just 48 Nakba, but like going back, right? Because people forget that Irgun and other Zionist mobs were doing a lot of this work of ethnic cleansing and political violence and so forth. You're somebody that understands that Herzl and Jabotinsky were explicitly white supremacists, and they used white supremacist argumentation, and they appealed to people like Cecil Rhodes for support in their project. Like, they were deeply connected. So I would love to just hear your thoughts on kind of what parts of the past in this struggle feel the most relevant and pertinent to you in our current moment.
They like to say that Israeli society has become more extreme and more right-wing and more racist. And I always refer back and say, did you read what these guys wrote? Did you see what they wrote? Do you remember what my dad was in the Haganah. Do you know what they did in 1940, from 1947? Actually, before that, in the 30s, they began, bombing markets and bombing buses and executing Palestinians. And, but let's say up the 47 to 49, do you know what Israeli society did and applauded and then taught as heroism? What I'm saying, this is direct line from the beginning to now. Everything we have seen was predictable and preventable.
Yep.
All of it was predictable and preventable. First of all, because they said they were going to do it. I mean, they said they were going to do it. They never
didn't take a crystal ball. They told you.
They told you what they did. And again, going back to the two racists, the two white supremacists, Rothschild and Balfour,
yep,
giving somebody else's country to the other. I mean, what did you expect? I mean, this is exactly what they were planning. This is exactly what they were talking about when Christian Zionists and then the Jewish Zionists talked about a land without a people. They knew there were people. They were doing commerce with Palestine. They were importing cotton and oil and barley and God knows what else from Palestine. They went to Palestine to visit. They went to Palestine to pray. And so they knew the people were there. There's no question about that. They investigated. People were there. There was strong connection between the Europeans and Palestine. But it's not that they weren't people, that they were a people of a different race. They were people of color, and therefore they didn't matter. It's not that they weren't there. It's just that they didn't matter because they were not white.
Yep.
And that is the key issue here. That is why they are expendable. And that is why to this day, nobody in the, so-called, quote unquote, civilized world is standing up to say not a single government, except the Spanish government recently, to stop it, to put an end to it. Where are the sanctions? Why is the Sixth Fleet not coming in and making sure that there are no more bombing of Gaza and providing humanitarian care? The Sixth Fleet works for us.
Yeah.
They should be there protecting the Palestinian people, making sure that there's an arms embargo, making sure that there's a no-fly zone, making sure that all the Palestinians are protected. Nobody's protecting Palestinians. And why aren't, again, Sixth Fleet, it works for us. Why aren't they doing this? That's exactly why, because this stems from history and an ideology that is supremacist and racist and genocidal. And again, it was preventable and predictable and preventable.
So I have my own, sort of theory and understanding as to, the answer to your question, why, international peacekeeping forces don't, get deployed and those things. And it really is informed in part by your, assessment of Rothschild and Balfour. What I've been saying for years is that you can't expect help from the UN, because the UN was brought to you by the same people that brought you the Balfour Declaration, the Berlin Conference, and Sykes-Picot, that it is essentially a gentleman's agreement amongst colonizing powers about how to divvy up the spoils without fighting with one another. And that's what international law essentially is. And so therefore they're not going to be coming to the rescue, because that's not what those mechanisms were designed to do. But I want to go back to the first place that you started, right? Which, this was all very predictable. And you can't talk about this contemporary moment as being some kind of unrecognizable iteration of Zionism, right? Because it reminds me of what I heard after Alex Preddy was murdered and after Nicole Good was murdered in Minnesota in ICE confrontations, is people saying, this is not the America that we know. This isn't who we are. And I'm like, I'm sorry, what? Hello, Black people would like a word, right?
Exactly.
Because I was stopped 17 times for driving while Black in that same city. And in one of those traffic stops, officer drew his service weapon and pointed it directly at my face. I could have died that day. I know what checkpoints feel like. I know what a fascist state feels like. I know what it's like to be surveilled. Genocidal, violence and surveilling and policing isn't anything new. And I think that that's part of the fiction of both American liberalism and liberal Zionism, right? Is that they want to represent, fascism and genocide as somehow aberrant, abnormal behavior in an otherwise okay system, right? Because it takes away what Nathan Irvin Huggins, great African-American historian, said. He said, to do otherwise requires you to look in the deforming mirror of truth.
Very similar, I think. I hate to bring Epstein into this, but it's the same thing that's shocking about Epstein. White colonizers, as soon as they came to any colony, actually, really, what did they do? They raped little girls. They tortured and enslaved little girls for sex. I mean, Epstein is a completely normal in this white supremacist reality.
Miko, we've never met in person, but I'm just gonna say I love you, man, because you make me feel sane. No, I said exactly this on Miriam Francois, the T. She asked, "What's most shocking?" And I said, "What's most shocking are the crimes, or the familiarity of the crimes." I didn't see anything in the Epstein files that I didn't see Thomas Jefferson do to an enslaved 12-year-old, right? That history then later called his mistress. Go ahead.
And well, just to that point, I visited the place here in Virginia a couple of times.
Monticello, yep.
Yeah. And I don't know if you've seen it, but they have a slave tour. And so you go through the slave tour, and it's painfully, I don't even know what word to use, but we don't know if it was consensual or not, is basically the bottom line. It may have been consensual.
Because a 12-year-old can give consent, right? That makes sense. Yeah, sure.
But not only him, it was basically a farm to raise, because he had single men working there, and then they would impregnate the slaves, and then the offspring would remain as slaves.
Yeah, breeding. They're
breeding ground for slavery. Yeah. I'm going, this is the beacon of I don't know what, democracy and all that nonsense that they make out of Jefferson. Are you out of your, are we people out of their mind? I mean, but the way they talk about it at the tour, that we don't know if it was consensual or not. So maybe it was all okay. I mean, these slave women, maybe they wanted to sleep with these thugs that were working there and leave their children as slaves. I mean, we don't know. And this is,
sometimes you got to laugh to keep from crying, because that is sheer madness. You know, that there's
and
no
so
other word for it.
That is glorified.
Yep.
Then what's shocking when you said it was shocking? What's shocking about the Epstein this whole story is that it's not shocking.
Right.
Nothing surprising about it. You know, these powerful people who are, you know, white and privileged, taking advantage of little girls. You know,
right, and I think so. I'm now remembering exactly what you said. It was not just the Rothschild and Balfour thing, but you had another one where you were asked about resistance. You said, "Are we out of our minds? Are we out of our minds condemning the resistance?" Because that's the part that gets written out of the story in the way that the history of American slavery functions. Is that the resistance was permanent and it was ubiquitous, and the only reason why abolition took place was because enslaved people made it so costly to maintain the system through their resistance, armed and otherwise. And these, you know, fictions, thank God, are falling away, right? The collapse of this empire, scales are being removed from the eyes. People are seeing for the first time. And I'm just going to end our discussion of the past before we move to the future with my own, you know, sort of kind of moment of clarity on understanding the interrelationship between Black liberation struggles, which we've just been framing, and Palestinian liberation. And for me, it was from Malcolm, right? Because again, Malcolm is my door to my faith tradition, but also to the Black radical tradition. We know, everyone knows about, or every anti-Zionist knows about Malcolm's 1964 article in the Egyptian Gazette, Zionist Logic, where he just mocks, you know, Zionist logic and says, where is your Messiah? Is your Messiah, you know, Ralph Bunche and the UN? Like explain, you know, your theory of Zionism. But I think what people are unaware of is that Malcolm visited Khan Yunis. Malcolm went to Gaza. Malcolm met with leaders of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And I learned from the dissertation, amazing dissertation research of one of my colleagues, Maitha Al-Hassan, that Malcolm, in his field notebooks, when he came back from Khan Yunis, he wrote, "This is a white Jewish population being empowered by white imperialists to move Arabs off their land." Malcolm immediately understood what he was looking at and framed it in terms of white supremacy, right? And when you understand that Zionism is just a regional variant of white supremacy, the same way that German Nazism was a regional variant of white supremacy, the same way that British imperialism weaponized a regional variant of white supremacy, the same way that those American regimes of enslavement were in a regional variant of white supremacy, then you understand what you're facing and also how you have to organize to resist it, because the enemy is the same enemy, right? And people forget that you can be a victim of white supremacy on one day and a perpetrator of white supremacist violence on another, right? Back to that extinction burst that we talked about. People forget that the Jews that were shoveled into ovens at Auschwitz, so many of them were in the last days and months of the war, after the war had already been decided, because these white supremacists, right, are going through their own extinction burst and enacting this horrific violence on European Jews. And people don't understand that you can be the victim of that kind of white supremacist violence and still turn around and become a perpetrator of white supremacist violence. Like you can be a victim of Nazism and then still nonetheless be embedded in white supremacist structures and habits of mind, so that you then enact those forms of violence yourself. And so, yeah, please.
No, I was just going to say, I think that I see it a little bit differently.
Please.
For two reasons. One, the vast majority of Holocaust survivors didn't go to Palestine. They rejected
Of course. Yeah, of course.
So it's not the same people. The ones that
Oh,
are
agreed. No. I'm not arguing that for that direct connection, but
okay.
continue.
Okay, I just want to make that clear. And the second thing is, and this might sound a little crazy, but what the Nazis did to the Jews, I don't think that was white supremacy.
Interesting.
And they were, and the reason that the Europeans and the Allies had to stop the Nazis were killing white people. They didn't do that against the Belgians for what they did in the Congo.
Nope, of course.
The same commanders who commanded the French resistance then went to North Africa and committed horrific crimes against,
absolutely,
in Algeria and so forth. So I think the reason it's a little strange because the way they came out against the Nazis was basically, I think, because the Nazis were killing white people. And if the Nazis did the exact same thing in Africa or in Bangladesh, like the British did, then they may not have been a problem. You know what I mean? I completely. There's kind of a weird kind of dynamic that went on there. And again, and the reason I said the thing about it's not the same people, because very often people say that and saying, how could people who suffered this and can now do this? And I'm like,
they didn't. Yeah, they didn't. We're in fundamental agreement on both points. So I'm glad that you created the opportunity for clarity. Not only is it a hypothetical that if they did this in Africa, there wouldn't have been a similar response. They did it in Africa. They did it in Africa. They did it in Africa first, right? You know, so the Herero massacre, early 20th century. I teach African history. These are mostly African history books behind me, right? And I have a graduate student, George Njung, who worked on German colonialism, and he described German massacres where they would literally tie up all the men in the village, rape the women in front of the men, then kill the men in front of the women, then kill the women, then kill the children, and then play catch with infants and end the game of catch with the bayonets of their rifles. And the world had nothing to say about that for exactly the reason that you mentioned. And Aimé Césaire, the great Black Caribbean intellectual, was the first to talk about it in Discourse on Colonialism, where he said that what happened is that fascism was when Europeans decided to do to one another what they had been doing to the colonial world all along. So we're in fundamental agreement. And I would argue that that Nazism's war on European Jewish populations, yes, they were white, and that doesn't mean that it wasn't white supremacist, in my view, in its orientation, because it was some kind of Semitic stain and barbarism and all of that structure of Western civilization. Because that's the other part is that non-white people, right, or off-white people, internalize white supremacist ideas all the time, and we enact them. Bell Hooks famously said, white supremacy isn't a white people's problem. White supremacy is embedded in all of our institutions. And the biggest thing that was offensive to me of Kamala Harris's presidential campaign is that this was this Black woman weaponizing Black womanhood in order to defend white supremacist genocide. And that just made me sick to my stomach. And just to close the last point before we move to the future, I could not agree more that these were not the same people. All I meant was that the justification that was utilized was the justification that was utilized was that this kind of white supremacist violence had been visited, and the reality is that anyone can see that Zionist political engagement and ideological practice is as close a cousin to the exterminationist philosophy of German Nazism. And remember, the German Nazis, Hitler wrote with admiration about the genocidal violence against Native Americans and Africans. Like, if you understand that white supremacy is the glue that holds it all together, it helps you read a bunch of other things.
Of course. And I just want to touch on something you may want to touch on.
Please do.
But it's just, you're talking about the Black and the Palestinian struggle. And I'm sure you know the story of George Jackson and the poem by Samir Al-Qasim.
Yeah, but tell it.
So when after George Jackson was murdered, they found this poem in his cell. And correct me if I'm wrong on the details. And I think for many years people thought it was his poem, and then they realized that he was reading a poem by a Palestinian poet, Samih al-Qasim.
Yep.
And so the fact that you could read a Palestinian poem and completely think that it's appropriate for the black liberation movement and to the Black Panthers is so telling. It's just so absolutely, you know, it's just right there. And I think it's one of the most incredible stories. I mean, it's so tragic, but it's so incredible that it is so obvious to anybody who wants to look that these struggles are deeply, deeply connected.
Beautiful.
Read a poem by one, not
and mistake it,
and mistake it for the other, because it makes so much sense. There's a beauty in it, but there's also, it's also profoundly tragic that so many people have to go through this.
I think it's definitely tragic, and I think that it does actually also light the way forward for us, because I think that being rooted in that Black liberation tradition, and especially the way that it reached out with those international dimensions, understanding what Césaire called that imperial boomerang, right? That what is done in the colonized world eventually comes back, that it helps kind of create this organic whole, that our struggles are indeed connected, that the Black liberation struggle, the struggle for Palestinian liberation, is one struggle. That's what made Malcolm so dangerous. It's what made Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture, right? Because SNCC becomes an anti-Zionist organization in 64, 65 on following Malcolm's example, and they get, attacked. But it's a consistent thread through the Black radical tradition. James Baldwin, 1979, open letter to the born again, says the state of Israel was not created for the salvation of the Jews. The state of Israel was created for the salvation of Western interests, right? Assata Shakur, Toni Morrison, and then not even to mention the Africans, Thomas Sankara, Nelson Mandela, and so forth. That understanding that it's not an abstract question, it's not a moral argument to say that our liberation is interconnected. It's a practical argument that orients you towards the political struggle that you need to engage in for collective liberation. So I guess that's our last, kind of window into this conversation, is what do you see as critical in our way forward towards Palestinian liberation and towards our collective liberation from here?
I think the most important thing is to enlarge the circle of people who get it. Mm-hmm. It's called the constituency of conscience around the world. And I stole this phrase from somebody else. It's not mine. And it's Israel has over 40 diplomatic missions in Africa. Mm-hmm. They are pushing Zionism. They are inviting young leaders and young entrepreneurs and teaching them and providing them, and on and on and on and on and on.
Yep.
And whenever I talk to, I'm interviewed by an African outlet or whatever the case may be, I'm going, why? I mean, Israel has contributed to the destruction of Africa.
Immiseration of people in the Congo. Dan Gertler by himself, right? Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
I mean, my father, still in uniform in the 60s, would go to Congo because the IDF was training Mobutu's army after they assassinated
of Lumumba.
Yep. Now, as a kid, he was coming back from Africa with all these cool things, and he would go. But now I'm going, what the hell? And the same thing with Iran, by the way, supporting the Shah. He would go to Iran a lot to help the Shah's.
Of course.
So I'm going, and then after that, I mean, they pillaged Africa, all over Africa.
Yep.
Why? And now, of course, they wanted to become observers in the African Union. Why in the world are you allowing this? Why in the world? So I think that's a really, really important point, to push that. The other thing is Black churches. Mm. The Zionists have been pouring resources into the Black churches for decades because they're always ahead of us. They're always ahead of us. They knew that someday people were going to come up and realize Zionism is white supremacy and racist. So they had to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. So then they came up with a new ridiculous definition that everybody, follows, like some kind of, like it came down from the mountain with Moses, the IHRA definition. Who the hell is the IHRA and why do they get to define things? So they're always ahead of us, and we got to catch up and then go far, far beyond them so that we can stop them. And I think, these are, why, so I think those are really, really important things. And there's a reason the Zionists are investing in this, because they can say that, look, we have good relations with Africans and with Black Americans and so on and so forth. And how can you say that?
I have Black friends. How can I be racist?
Exactly. How can I possibly raise some of my best friends? So, but this is really important to awaken these forces, and some of the Arab countries and Muslim countries that are still on the fence, that are not haven't normalized yet. We need to support the anti-normalization forces. I remember when Indonesia was hosting the 20 and under FIFA championships. And they allowed these the apartheid team to come and participate. So and the ambassadors, quote unquote, of the Palestinian Authority was there saying, fine, gave it his okay. So the Indonesian anti-normalization people called me and asked me to put out a video. Gradually, some of the governors of some of the states in Indonesia said they won't allow them to come in. And then eventually it got to a point where it was obviously not going to work. So FIFA took the tournament out of Indonesia, stating security concerns. So in other words, Indonesians were punished for doing the right thing. So it's on us to support these forces in all these countries that don't want to normalize. And we're not there. And the other side is there. So Pakistan, Indonesia. Indonesia is part of the peace board. Because the other side is there. So I think these are really, really important things for us to consider. And there's a lot to do, and we just got to do it all. We got to work with Congress. We got to work with public opinion. We've got to be everywhere. And there's not that many of us.
Support. What I heard, kind of as the core of your response is that we have to support the resistance in every way that we can, with political cover, all of it. And so I'll just, because I know we're short on time, if you'll permit me, I'll lay out my case for what I think is the critical intervention. If we understand, the Zionist entity, the way that Caspar Weinberger described it, right? Reagan Secretary of Defense, he said Israel, and I'm only using it because it's in a quote, right? We've agreed. I love how you called it the apartheid soccer team. That's great. Like that's outstanding. This is beautiful on the fly editing by both of us. But he said Israel is America's unsinkable battleship in the Middle East. Right. So if you understand that this is the proxy that allows U.S. imperialism to structure its resource extraction, then the place where Zionism is most vulnerable is inside the imperial core. And I think that that's the reason that the fight over the narrative around Zionism, especially for the younger generation, has been so brutal. It's the reason for, them sending jackboot thugs to remove kids from, peaceful encampments on my campus in blue states, not red states, right? This is a bipartisan, genocidal regime. I think it's because they perceive that the principal vulnerability is inside the imperial core. And so my own action on this is to organize for political power inside the imperial core, because I think that if you damage the imperial core's ability to feed that complex, then you end it, right? We can hasten that collapse. And so that's literally the reason why I'm running for office, because Kwame Ture, who I mentioned before, he said revolutionaries don't just mobilize around issues. Revolutionaries organize against systems. For me, our mobilization, the protest against these things has not been sufficient and cannot be sufficient, because nonviolent protest, he said, Kwame Ture said, its success is predicated on your opponent having a conscience, and America has none. Like, you can't make a moral appeal to white supremacists. That's not going to work, right? You have to contest them for power. And I think that one of the places where they're most vulnerable is in political contestations. I'm at 5% right now, 8 points off of the lead in California. If you got an anti-Zionist into executive authority in the state of California, the third largest economy on the planet, and the state of California divested from any genocidal industry, that's the end of Israel. That's the end. That's the end of them, right? And it's this strategic vulnerability in the system because corporate capitalism it controls the mainstream media. It controls those two political parties, but we still have these pesky elections. And Malcolm, that's the reason why Malcolm organized for political power. He said, we're going to knock on every door. We're going to register every black face behind every door, not as a Democrat, not as a Republican. We're going to say, show us your card. And whoever didn't have the responsibility to get themselves registered, we might just move them out of town. It's going to be the ballot or the bullet. I actually believe that we can take power from these people right here in the imperial core, and they will never recover from it.
Yeah,
and that,
I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's way past time. But I just want to touch on something.
Please.
When you talked about the nonviolence, resistance assumes that there's a moral. I was there in 2005. Palestinian decided to create this. The popular resistance, which was focused on unarmed resistance, non-armed resistance, and protests every weekend. And the amount of violence that they received was shocking. One time I went to one of these marches, and I brought a Palestinian friend who's a professor. He lived overseas for many years, and he wanted to, he taught me Arabic. Actually, I was taking Arabic with him in
MashaAllah.
And so I took him, and we're marching. You're walking, and it's basically, when you look at the Palestinian side, people are wearing T-shirts, holding flags, kids running around. So it seems really benign, and then all of a sudden, this barrage of bullets and tear gas. And this old gentleman, this professor, he was like, why are they shooting? What's going on? What the hell are they doing? He was so shocked. I said, well, welcome back to Palestine, sort of thing. And then I went to this other town where they throw rocks. And that's kind of their thing, and everybody said, oh, that's violent. That's not okay. And my dear friend, who's, from that, he goes, we're defending ourselves. We're not the ones invading. We're farmers. When we see a danger, we pick up a rock, if it's an animal or something, this occupation is like a snake. It's coming in to kill us. What do you expect us to do? This is violence? You call us? We're the ones being violent? So, that's assumed. And we know, and it's been proven that the other side has no morals. And yet the Palestinians continue
to have morals.
Continue the vast majority of their protests and their demonstrations and their resistance is still through film, through literature, through nonviolent resistance, through civil disobedience, and on and on and on, because they do have morals.
Yes,
they do maintain the moral.
Because our we say in Islam, our oppressors are not our teachers. We don't learn our morals from our oppressors, right? We learn our morals from our tradition, we can start to wrap things up. But that you mentioned, Yahya Sinwar should be on T-shirts, right? He threw with only one arm still left, right? That you throw with whatever you have. Rafat El Arir, before he was martyred, said that if they come for me, then I won't have anything. I'm just a writer, but I'll throw my pen. Right? We resist because no fist, as the African expression goes, no fist is big enough to block out the sky. We resist because we're human, and white supremacy, despite all of its efforts to dehumanize, cannot diminish the humanity in the oppressed. It only diminishes the humanity of the oppressor,
which was never there to begin with.
If they could become barbarians at that scale, then their humanity was already compromised.
There was never humanity at some point in their childhood. I was talking to this African-American student, was interviewing me just before we started. And I was talking about the fear. She said, "Why were you
Mhm.
afraid to go into go into Palestinian towns and all this?" And I said, "Well, the way white supremacy works is by injecting this fear that has no basis on history,
Yep.
has no foundation, has no reason other than the other side is the other, and they have a different skin tone or speak a different language." And so I couldn't explain why I was scared when the first time I drove to the West Bank or into Palestinian towns in Palestine. I couldn't explain it.
You were
If you
just
ask,
conditioned. You were
but I
conditioned.
was terrified. I thought this is going to be my last day on earth because these people are going to kill me because I look like they can see that I'm not a Palestinian and I'm driving a car with a yellow license plate, which means I'm Israeli. And it was the first, nobody's ever asked me, the first time I actually had to explain that fear is the white supremacy. It's the core of the white supremacy, and that's how they maintain it. What are you afraid of? Why are you afraid when you see a black man walking at night, in the evening? You know what I mean? But this is white supremacy. We have to cross the
You're
street.
conditioned for it.
We see a bunch of black kids in the corner. Oh, that must be doing something really bad. I should cross the street because I'm a white. This is how they maintain it because it's so deeply, deeply ingrained in us since childhood as white people. Yeah. So I was telling her, I was liberated by Palestinians. I was liberated from that by my Palestinian comrades, thankfully, that I can see things now, and for what they are.
As a human being. As a human being.
Yeah. And I can hang out with guys like you.
And what I'm going to suggest is that we have to continue this conversation in person because we wanted to keep this to 45 minutes and we've done that, but we are just getting started. So I hope that we can get you out here to the West Coast.
I'd love to.
Sometime before the primary on June 2nd, so that you can see the political movement that we're building, to try to actually build genuine anti-Zionist political power. Really, really appreciate you, brother. Thank you for making the time, and we'll get you out here to Cali, so that you don't have to put up with those DC snowstorms. LOL.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you too, man. It's been a pleasure. A real pleasure.
We'll talk again real soon. Appreciate you.
All right. Take care.